You know, wedding planning can seem like a lot, maybe even too much. That's why Simply Eloped is here to make it easy and deeply human. They've planned over 14,000 personalized ceremonies in 37 stunning U.S. destinations, and they coordinate every detail that's important to you with real care. You just bring your marriage license and, well, they'll take care of the rest. Your love deserves simplicity. Visit simplyeloped.com.
Were things better when the mob ran Las Vegas? And how much of the city did the mob actually run? Today on CityCast Las Vegas, we're revisiting an episode I did with Jeff Schumacher, VP of Exhibits and Programs at the Mob Museum. And we'll find out why some of us love the idea of a mob-run city so much. Also, heads up, we've got an extended cut in the members-only feed that goes deep into Vegas's early mob history. You can learn more at membership.citycast.fm. It's Tuesday, December 30th. I'm Sarah Lohman, and here's what Las Vegas is talking about. Okay, Jeff, maybe my gut feeling is wrong here, but was it better when the mob ran Vegas than it is now?
You know, it's a question that we address at the museum almost every day.
Wow.
Because guests come in and they want to know, what was it like when the mob ran Vegas? And they want to know, is it better? And all of this, the same question that you're asking and that you're questioning is the one that we deal with every day. And I spent a lot of time thinking about this, which is strange. But let me see if I can break it down. So first of all, Las Vegas was a very different place when the mob was here than it is today. I mean, we're 2.4 million people today. When the mob was prominent here, we were in the hundreds of thousands of people. It was a much smaller community, and it was a more tight-knit community as well. So, people knew each other. There was a lot of familiarity that would happen between, people who would come into a casino. They would know the workers there, right? And so they could, they would say, "Oh, hey, Jim, how are you doing? Hey, here's slip you a comp for a buffet or whatever."
It was more of a small town. Definitely a small city.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I think you have to raise the question about whether the mob actually ever ran Vegas. I think there's a fundamental problem with that statement. You hear it all the time.
Yeah.
You hear it all the time. But when you think about Las Vegas, even when it was a smaller community, and it was more focused around the casino industry than it is today, it was still only the mob was only a part of what we were doing here. If you were to ask people in 1970, let's say, who runs Vegas, they would not probably have said the mob. They would have said Ralph Lamb, probably.
Who's
Sheriff Ralph Lamb. He was the sheriff. And he was a very powerful individual politically here. He had a real hand in what was going on in the crime side of things, and with even like licensing for casinos and for taverns and so forth. He had a great deal of influence over that. So Ralph Lamb was on the side of the law, and people at that time probably would have said he was running things. Others might have said, well, it's the county commission that runs things, or the city council, because there were still, a lot of really sort of charismatic figures at that time who were on these boards, and they had a lot of influence. So I think there is something fundamentally wrong with that. Now, having said that, the mob obviously had a great deal of influence on the Strip. One of the things that they did was their tenure coincided with a time when Las Vegas was run very differently, the casinos in particular, right? You could get a lot of things for free. Parking, for example.
If there's one thing I've learned about Las Vegas since I moved here is how passionate Las Vegas feels about free parking.
It was part of the culture here was free parking, and other things would be free too. And if you were a regular customer at a particular place, but also things were a lot cheaper. when the mob ran it. And there was, because the gambling was still in the forefront. Gambling was what people came to Las Vegas to do. They spent most of the money they brought with them to gamble with. They didn't spend it for shopping or for Cirque du Soleil shows or whatever. The money would go toward gambling. And that's what, that was the leader. And then everything else was just, like buffets and restaurants, and all of that could be discounted because it was just accoutrements to the gambling.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, the mob didn't actually run Las Vegas, although at some points they had quite a bit of influence here, but that a lot of the things that people remember very nostalgically in a positive way actually had nothing to do with the mob at all.
I think that's it. Yes, I think that's accurate. And I will say, I mean, I want to give, I guess, the mob its due, if you will. The guys who we're talking about, guys like Mo Dalitz at the Desert Inn, the folks who ran different casinos here, they had a mindset about service and about customers that unless you did something wrong, unless you did something very bad, you were generally treated very well. And they believed in that philosophy. But I don't think that is unique to the mob, right? I mean, I think there were, supper clubs in the Midwest, and there were, honky tonks in the South where people also received good treatment. It's not like you're a hotel in Miami in the 1950s, you would receive great treatment too. So the mob learned these things. The guys who were working these casinos, they learned these things in other parts of the country, and they brought those morals or those practices here. But I don't think they're unique to Las Vegas.
So who do you think, dealing with the visitorship at the Mob Museum, which I visited, I'm part of the visitorship there, who do you think has this nostalgia for a mob-run Vegas, and why?
It's a great point. I think there's a lot of nostalgia for Las Vegas in the mid-century, 50s, 60s, 70s. This notion that there was a much closer relationship between the guest and the customers and the hosts, that there was a more intimate experience than you can have today. When you think about the MGM Grand today on the Las Vegas Strip, right? 5,000 rooms. So that's a minimum of 10,000 customers. But there's actually more than that if they're sold out, right? Because there's all these shows going on, all these restaurants, and people are coming in. So let's say there's 15,000 customers there at one time, and there's, I don't know what the number is, 2,500 employees to serve them. Now we've got close to 20,000 people in this one building. I mean, how can you possibly imagine that you're going to be recognized by one of the employees if you're one of these people? And so, you're inherently going to feel more like a number. You're going to feel more like just another person walking in. But if you walked into the Sands Hotel in 1952 and you were one of, a few hundred people there at that time, and you had been there before, the chances are good that somebody's going to go, "Hey, how are you doing? I remember the last time you were here. I know you like, the steak dinner. Let's go," whatever. There's a lot of nostalgia for that. And that is attached to the mob because that was the era when the mob was here. There is this perception too that when the mob was here, crime was lower. The crime rate was lower.
Yeah.
And that's actually just factually untrue. Because if you go back and you read the newspapers and you read the statistics from particularly the 70s, Las Vegas had one of the highest homicide rates in the country in the late 70s and early 80s.
I should explain. I'm chuckling not at homicide, but at the fact that people would think a mob-run city would have a low crime rate. So the homicide does seem to track for me with the mob being here.
Well, the perception, though, is that because the mob was here, the real bad guys, the lowlifes, were not going to act up, because if they did, they would cross the mob and then they would be in trouble. I think there's an ounce of truth to that, in the sense that if you were wanted to be engaged in some kind of criminal activity in Las Vegas in 1975, let's just making up a year, if you were crossing in some way the criminal activity happening with Tony Spilotro and his Chicago mob guys, that could be a problem for you. You may not want to do that because there could be repercussions, street justice, if you will. But for the most part, these things were not intersecting. Tony Spilotro was engaged, most importantly, with skimming money from the Stardust Hotel. Secondarily, he had what they called the Hole in the Wall Gang, which he had formed a burglary ring, and they were burglarizing businesses and homes. And in part, a lot of these burglaries were arranged, meaning that the owner knew it was going to happen, and they did it for the insurance money or whatever. So it was a kind of a racket unto itself. So you could be a criminal over here doing your thing and get away with it, and the mob couldn't care less what you're doing. So I think there's a misnomer about this crime rate business, the idea that the mob suppressed crime.
I'm also sort of tickled that we associate the mob basically with good customer service.
Well, I think that has to do with, I think it has a little bit to do with the movies and the way people perceive mobsters to be these well-dressed, very formal, tradition-bound people. But I think it also comes from the fact there's a real part to that, which is a lot of these mob guys who came to Las Vegas came from other illegal casinos that they were operating around the country. Also, many of them came from the entertainment business. So they were operating nightclubs and showrooms and lounges around the country, where inherently service is important. You need to, they were customer-based businesses. They weren't making widgets, where they couldn't care less about the customer. The customer actually mattered to them. And so these front-facing individuals who were involved in organized crime were indeed focused on customer service. I really do believe that.
Meet Nevada Health Link, Nevada's official health insurance marketplace. Your link to new plans, more selection, free assistance, and name brand health insurance all bundled together. Our marketplace is growing and has the state's widest selection of quality health plans. Find savings and quality coverage regardless of your income with new state-approved Battle-Born state plans. Visit NevadaHealthLink.com. In a few minutes, you can find the health plan that's right for you.
Nevada Health Link. Our plans are made for your plans.
Conoce Nevada Health Link, el mercado oficial de seguros médicos de Nevada. Tu lugar para encontrar opciones, ayuda en español y seguros de salud a tu alcance. Estamos creciendo y tenemos la mayor variedad de planes en el estado. Encuentra planes a tu alcance sin importar tus ingresos con los nuevos Battle-Born State Plans aprobados por el estado. Visita NevadaHealthLink.com y en solo minutos encontrarás el seguro de salud que necesitas y mereces.
Nevada Health Link. Our plans are made for your plans.
So if you crossed the mob, what were the consequences?
Well, they were probably nothing good. I will say, though, that I think one thing that we also talk about a lot at the museum is the fact that this idea that there's all these bodies buried out in the desert around Las Vegas is a bit exaggerated.
Because they're all in Lake Mead.
Well, they're either they're all in Lake Mead, which is possible, or there weren't nearly as many murders happening as, mob-related murders as we thought. Now, there were some. There's no question there were some. And that some of those individuals were dumped out in the desert. That did happen. But it didn't happen nearly as often as people think. Now, if you cross the mob, the first thing that, they would want you to do is get the heck out of Las Vegas. We don't want you here. And a lot of times that was sufficient, deterrent. Like, you're gone. I don't want to see your face in Las Vegas again, kind of thing. But second of all, clearly violence was a threat, and extortion was a big threat. In other words, pay us money, give us money. If you want to keep doing what you're doing, you need to cut us in on it, or you need to pay us off. But ultimately, things could lead to murder. And so, for example, in the 70s in particular, there were a number of individuals who did cross the mob and ended up dead. And one of probably the most infamous murder in that period was Al Bramlett. Al Bramlett was the head of the culinary union here, and he was an extremely powerful individual. In fact, I mentioned earlier about Ralph. People at the time would have said the most powerful people in Las Vegas, they would have said Ralph Lamb. Number two, they probably would have said Al Bramlett, because as the head of the culinary union, he was extremely powerful and influential. However, he crossed organized crime here. He refused to pay for a job that he had asked them to do, which was to firebomb a restaurant. And when the firebombing didn't occur the way he wanted it to, he refused to pay them for the work. So they retaliated by kidnapping him at the airport and then driving him out in the desert, killing him, burying him in the desert, and with only his hands sticking up above the dirt.
Oh my God!
And he was discovered by a hiker. His body was discovered by a hiker, and they found out what happened to Al Bramlett.
Wow. I mean, do you think that the average visitor to Vegas in like the mid 20th century, so we're talking like 40s through 80s, is that when you would say the era of, okay. So do you think the average visitor to Vegas in that time had a sense of the behind the scenes criminal element?
I think there was a mystique about Las Vegas during that time. In other words, people had a sense that the mob was here. They didn't know what it looked like. They didn't know who was who. There was a lot of mystery about that. One of the things we have to remember at the museum now is like the things that we know and take for granted that we know about all of this history was not known at the time. You know, this is stuff we've picked up in the years since then. So I don't think people had a lot of specifics, but they had this idea that there were mobsters here. And it actually, I think, contributed positively to Las Vegas tourism, because it created this notion that somehow, well, I'm at the show here. I'm in the lounge. Those guys at the table next to me, they look like they could be in the mob. That's cool, you know. There's just something about Las Vegas that sort of almost like danger tourism a little bit, you know, where the idea that there's a little bit of a risk involved. I think people like that.
You know, that's fascinating because I've lived both in New York and in Cleveland, and that is definitely not the vibe. People weren't visiting Cleveland in the 80s hoping to see a mobster.
No, but they were probably more prominent there than they were here.
So I know the mob was sort of losing its grip on power here by the 1980s. Why is that?
The primary reason that the mob lost out in Las Vegas there were two reasons. One is law enforcement really started cracking down on the skim. In other words, for a long time, skimming was happening at the casinos with really very little oversight. And it was happening quietly. And it was almost as if there was this tacit understanding that a portion of those proceeds were going to end up in the aforementioned Cleveland. But by the 1970s, there was a feeling that Las Vegas had arrived, that Las Vegas was a real place. It wasn't going to dry up and blow away. And that we don't need this mob presence anymore. Maybe these guys are more hindrance than help. They certainly helped build the community, but maybe we don't need them anymore. And so there was an concerted effort at the state level with the Gaming Control Board to become more aggressive against the mob. And more importantly, the FBI. So the FBI in the late 70s really took an interest in Las Vegas and wanted to root out the mob. So what you saw was the result of that was some very big court cases, trials that occurred that rooted out the skimming that was happening at, you know, the Stardust Hotel, the Tropicana Hotel, the Aladdin Hotel, and so forth. And that was the biggest thing. The other thing that's related was technology, right? There was this ability to scrutinize, to watch, to surveil, wiretaps, bugs, surveillance equipment. All of these things helped law enforcement to really build better cases against these mobsters and to trace money. That was another important thing. And to be able to show, you know, that the accounting was crooked.
So are there still elements of organized crime here in Vegas?
I would say in the casino industry, no. The corporations they rule the roost here. There's no question about that. In terms of the casinos, I would say no. And in terms of actual mobsters walking the streets, I would say there are a few. Most of them are retired. from other places because Las Vegas is a great retirement community. Let's retire here. And literally that has happened where I've met guys who say, and I've verified their history where like, I'm out of the rackets now. I'm living in Henderson in a suburb. And it's sort of interesting that they're living, the people in their surrounding their neighborhood probably don't know who they are, So there are retirees here. As far as actual organized crime, I think it would manifest differently today. Cybercrime, right? Mexican drug cartels, Russian organized crime, things like that are much more prominent today. Outlaw motorcycle gangs. We had that shootout out on US 95 a few years ago with the Hells Angels and another gang. This stuff still happens. It still exists. It just isn't the traditional mob that used to run the casinos.
Last question. What do you think should stay in the past about Vegas's mob history?
Well, I think for one thing, something I didn't get a chance to say yet that I would take advantage of now is the skimming that was going on. All this money that was being skimmed from the casinos from the 40s through the 80s was money that should have been taxed by the state of Nevada. This is money that then could have gone into the coffers of the state government that could have trickled down to build roads, to build schools, to pay teachers, to pay firefighters, to pay police officers. It was money that was stolen from the state of Nevada, from Las Vegas, and sent elsewhere. It almost always went to some other state. And we can't make that out like that. Oh, it's okay. It was no big deal. Victimless crime or something like that. No, it was not a victimless crime. Nevada suffered for years from lack of funding, and we still do, of course, for other reasons. But at the time, we were suffering from lack of funding for schools and everything else in part because the mob was siphoning all this money out of our state. And I don't think we should condone that. I think we should condemn that. And we should recognize that that was a crime and that it was something that, we're talking hundreds of millions, possibly billions of dollars that could have stayed in the state of Nevada and invested here.
Which means that every single citizen of the state of Nevada was a victim of that crime.
Yes, absolutely right.
Jeff, thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating. We always love having you on.
Thank you very much for having me.
And that's all for today here on CityCast Las Vegas. Hey, if you enjoyed this show, share it with a friend. You can rate the show and leave us a review that helps us out, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. Don't forget, you can support this show and get great perks by becoming a CityCast Las Vegas neighbor at membership.citycast.fm. We'll be back in the new year, January 2nd, with more news from around the city. Take care.